What up, African World? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. We talk a lot about the Moors and in general black soldiers in the medieval world, and we oftentimes romanticize them. But today, I wanted to take a closer look at their history and their origin and see what conclusions we can draw from it, providing further insight into the legacy of the black soldiers of North Africa. And as always, if you want to support the home team, you can do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to Afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. All links to Patreon, Afrographics, and home team merchandise are in the description box below. In the early days of Islam, Arabs began to extend their hand to slaves, enticing them to join their armies, and in return, they would gain freedom. During the expansion phase of Islam, Arab armies in the 7th and early 8th centuries gained support from enslaved people of conquered lands. Initially, these people came from the Middle East and from various Berber groups, but these men weren't actually considered slaves because they were later freed upon their service. One of the earliest mentions of a black soldier was Washi during the time of Muhammad, and it was said that he distinguished himself in battle, especially during the capture of Mecca. However, in the 9th century, the advancement of an exclusive slave army began to arise all over the Islamic world. In North Africa, these slave armies became more desirable as ambitious governors sought them out to create autonomous principalities. They believed these slave soldiers would be loyal to them in totality. This was because the slave soldiers did not come from the ethnic group of the governor, and so was not invested in the needs and concerns of the majority population. The caliphs themselves began to adopt this tradition to comfortably enforce their power and not worry about any Arab or Berber dissidents. Ahmed Toulon, who came to power in 884, the first independent ruler of Muslim Egypt, relied heavily on black slave soldiers, most of which came from Sudan, many of them Nubian. Upon his death, he is said to have possessed 24,000 white soldiers and 45,000 black soldiers. Ahmed Toulon's son was protected by 1,000 black guards. One chronicler had this to say, "Wearing black cloaks and black turbans, so that a watcher could fancy them to be a black sea spreading over the face of the earth because of the blackness of their color and of their garments, with the glitter of their shields, of the chasing on their swords, and of the helmets under their turbans. They made a really splendid sight." The history of black soldiers in Egypt was an strange one at some points because after their sultan died, they usually became subject to the moral will of the local population, and the white soldiers sometimes massacred them or stripped them from power. Despite this often conflicting relationship, black soldiers were just far too valuable in Egypt to abandon them completely. Black soldiers served the various rulers of medieval Egypt, and under the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo, black regiments known as Abd al-Shira, or the slaves by purchase, formed an important part of the military establishment. They were particularly prominent in the mid-11th century during the reign of al-Mustansir, when for a while the real ruler of Egypt was the caliph's mother, a Sudanese slave woman of remarkable strength of character. There were frequent clashes between black regiments and those of other races and occasional friction with the civil population. One such incident occurred in 1021 when the Caliph al-Hakim sent his black troops against the people of Old Cairo, and the white troops joined forces to defend them. In 1062 and again in 1067, the black troops were defeated by their white colleagues in pitched battles and driven out of Cairo to Upper Egypt. Later, they returned and played a role of some importance under the last Fatimid caliphs. Over the course of time, the use of slave soldiers grew rapidly, and it became the norm for Muslim rulers to acquire slave palace guards and slave armies. These soldiers served to maintain the ruler in his palace, protect the capital, and uphold imperial authority. One of the primary reasons for the rapid growth of slave armies was the need for rulers to have complete control over their soldiers and not be challenged by any intermediate power or opposing ethnic loyalties that would come from free Arabs or Berbers. It would be very difficult for a slave army originating from the interior of Africa to rally up the local Arab and Berber populace because of the ideological, social, and political divisions between them. This historical perspective is the lens in which we should view Moorish history. For example, the first emir or high commander of Spain under the Muslims was Abd al-Rahman I, and he was known to have kept a large personal guard of black troops. He founded the Muslim dynasty that ruled a large portion of Spain for nearly 3 centuries, and his successors used black soldiers especially to maintain order. Now, here is where a lot of the confusion comes in. When people look at this history and say the Moors were black people, it doesn't mean that there weren't any Arab or Berber soldiers. In fact, at various times in Moorish history, there were more Arab and Berber soldiers than black soldiers. But the idea of saying the Moors were black is to express how the black soldiers were used to reinforce the Sultan's power. This is why the Spaniards in their literature and artwork oftentimes represented the power of the Moors with an image of a black man, because it was the black soldiers who were largely used to enforce Moorish authority. It's not that they didn't see any Arab or Berber soldiers or that all the Moors were black, but they knew that if any rebellions occurred, they would be met by black men, and upon sight of the Sultan, they would also see him surrounded by a sea of black men. In other words, black men were the symbol of power in Spain. That is the context of Moorish history and Moorish power. Essentially, black men were the backbone of Moorish supremacy. Even in Tunisia, black troops became very useful. They were recruited in the armies of various rulers between the 9th and 11th centuries. Perhaps the most significant use of black soldiers in northern African history comes out of Morocco. In the 17th century to early 18th century, the Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Ismail, made great use of black soldiers to solidify his power. Moulay Ismail felt the immediate threat to his rule would come from his own people, subjects of the Moroccan state, and the Turks in Algeria. He assembled the largest army in Moroccan history, consisting of 250,000 black soldiers, allowing him to exert great authority through which he was able to undermine the power and influence of local tribal groups in his nation. These soldiers were mated with black slave girls to produce the next generation of male soldiers and female servants. The youngsters began training at 10 and were mated at 15. The Sultan went even further by requesting that the tribes turn over their weapons and horses to the black army. Al-Hassan al-Yusi, an eminent Sufi scholar, articulated the concerns of the tribes in a letter addressed to the Sultan in which he criticized the Sultan for disarming the Moroccan tribes. The black army's strong loyalty to the Sultan and the prerogatives they enjoyed threatened the interests of the Moroccan tribes and caused resentment and jealousy. The tribe's resentment also focused on the army and revived and reinforced the negative perception of black people. Although the success of the army in unifying Morocco against internal dissidents and external hostilities was impressive, the army did not try to win the trust of the Moroccan people. On the contrary, they were generally cut off from society and formed isolated communities in their garrisons and posts. They were feared, but not admired. The Black Guard were mainly in charge of collecting taxes and patrolling Morocco's unstable countryside. They crushed rebellions against Ismail's rule, not only by local tribes, but also by Ismail's sons, who defected from service as his provincial governors to become future usurpers of his throne. Black soldiers were even frequently used to oversee European slaves who were forced to work on Ismail's building projects in the imperial capital of Meknes. The legacy of black soldiers in North Africa is complicated in my opinion. It's something that should be acknowledged, but ultimately, black men not only symbolize power in North Africa, they were instrumental in the advancement of empires and even the stability of various nations. However, I wouldn't look at this history as an empowering narrative for our community, as we so frequently seem to do with our constant veneration of the Moors, because for the most part, these brilliant men were not used to advance a black nation or their own ethnic needs and concerns. They were shackled by Islam and the moral bankruptcy of Arab culture. They had little to no agency the majority of the time, and they existed on trinkets from Arab sultans. The story of the black soldier in North Africa has a paralyzing dichotomy because, although he was highly favorable and seen as incredibly valuable amongst other groups, it would seem as though he didn't see much value in himself, perhaps content in his own docile existence. Black men's role in North Africa is a history some may find drops of pride, but it's mainly a history that haunts us with shame. Pawns don't really have true glory. They're just pawns. But that's just me. I'm really interested to see what you guys think, so be sure to let me know in the comment section. I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help out in its continued production, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.